Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we are covering Chapter 7 of the Environmental and Natural Resource Economics video series. As always, I'm working off the 9th edition of the Tom Tietenberg Environmental and Natural Resource Economics textbook. I've provided a link in the video description. As well, if you're interested in any investment or macroeconomic research, be sure to check out my Seeking Alpha profile, where I release a lot of reports applying a lot of the concepts that I talk about in my videos on the channel. So in Chapter 7, usually this chapter follows the midterm in the course, and so post midterm, I would say that a lot of these chapters are much more lengthy in nature and a lot less numerical. There is a benefit because you don't really need a calculator anymore, but at the same time, there are a lot of concepts that you need to understand. So my videos are going to probably increase in length to maybe 40 to 50 minutes. So more talking for me, more listening for you. So let's get started. So Chapter 7. Quick introduction. Currently, many industrialized countries depend on oil and natural gas for the majority of their energy needs. According to the International Energy Agency, these resources together supply 59% of all primary energy consumed worldwide. Adding coal, another fossil fuel resource, increases the share to 86% of the total. So fossil fuels are depletable, non-recyclable sources of energy. And this is what Chapter 7 is going to talk about. It's going to look at different depletable fossil fuels and energy sources that society and economies can turn to, right? Even if we cannot precisely determine when the fuels on which we currently depend on will run out, we still need to think about the process of transition to new energy sources. According to depletable resource methods, which we talked about in Chapter 6, oil and natural gas would be used until the marginal cost of further use exceeded the marginal cost of substitute resources, either more abundant depletable resources such as coal or renewable sources such as energy. So it's all about, again, in Chapter 6, we talked about as the depletable resource continues to be depleted, the marginal cost of extraction will increase, and therefore the marginal cost of using and really producing that resource will increase in value until it will not be profitable to really use that resource anymore because there isn't a substitute resource, whether it's renewable or another depletable resource, which is a cheaper allocation. Okay, so the first kind of section is about natural gas and price controls. So the increasing importance of the automobile for transportation created a rising demand for gasoline, which in turn stimulated a search for new sources of crude oil. This exploration activity uncovered large quantities of natural gas in addition to large quantities of crude oil. As natural gas was discovered, it replaced manufactured gas and some coal in the geographic areas where it was found. Then, as geographically dispersed demand developed for these increasingly available gas, a long-distance system of gas pipelines was constructed. The regulation of natural gas began in 1938 with the passage of the Natural Gas Act. In 1954, a Supreme Court decision in Phillips Petroleum versus Wisconsin forced the FPC to extend their price control regulations to the producer. The ceiling would prevent prices from reaching their normal levels. Since price increases are at the source of the incentive to conserve, the lower prices would cause more of the resource to be used in earlier years. Consumption levels in those years would be higher under price controls than without them. Supply-wise, once the marginal cost rose to the price ceiling, no more would be produced in spite of the large demand for the resource at that price. So essentially, with the development of natural gas resources across the United States, the demand for natural gas continued to increase, and so Congress decided to implement price ceilings in order to limit the price of natural gas. Unfortunately, this has several implications, and primarily the first one is it would cause more of the resource to be used up in the earlier years. In addition, the transition to another resource once the marginal cost hit that transition point would be significantly more abrupt in an earlier period. Right? So the combined impact of these demand and supply effects would be to distort the allocation significantly. While a number of aspects differentiate this allocation from an efficient one, several are of particular importance. So one, more of the resources left in the ground under the price ceiling. The rate of consumption is too high in the early years because it is significantly cheaper than it should be. The time of transition is earlier because once again, more is consumed earlier. And the transition is abrupt. So with prices suddenly jumping to a new and higher level. So as you can see by the chart over here, we have the quantity of resources extracted on the y-axis and the time period on the x-axis. And so as you can see, as the quantity of resources extracted continues to decline because it is a depletable resource, the switch point occurs, but there's a huge jump in the amount of the quantity extracted. And that's also represented in in the graph B over here, where over time the marginal cost increases, eventually intersecting with price. And the moment that price and marginal cost intersect, there's a significant jump to the transition resource, whatever it will be, whether it's a renewable resource or coal. Okay, so price controls may cause other problems as well. Up to this point, we have discussed permanent controls. Not all price controls are permanent. They can change unpredictably at the whim of the political process. The fact that prices could suddenly rise when the ceiling is lifted also creates unfortunate incentives. If producers expect a large price increase in the near future, they have an incentive to stop production and wait for the higher prices. This could cause severe problems for consumers. It seems fair to conclude that by sapping the economic system of its ability to respond to changing conditions, price controls on natural gas created a significant amount of turmoil. Why did Congress embark on such a counterproductive policy when considering the overall decline in total economic surplus? Well, the answer is found in rent-seeking behavior that can be explained through the use of our consumer and producer surplus model. So here is the effects of price control and represented in this model. And so essentially so an efficient market allocation would result in Q star supplied at P star. So you have Q star and P star. So the efficient allocation would be at this intersection point between the demand curve and the supply curve of F0. Now that would be the efficient allocation. Now suppose that a price ceiling were established. We know that this price ceiling would reduce the marginal user cost because higher future prices would no longer be possible. This has the effect of lowering the perceived supply curve. So the supply curve shifts down to SI over here. And now the new intersection point between the demand curve and the SI curve is at QC and PC. Now, as you can see over here, price is lower and quantity is higher. As a result of this shift in the perceived supply curve, current production would expand to QC and price would fall to PC. Current consumers would unambiguously be better off since consumer surplus would be area A, B plus C. So, we're looking at that supply price line, and anything above it and under the demand curve is the consumer surplus. And as you can see, A, B, and C are the consumer surplus at the new scenario versus the previous where above that price line only consumer surplus of A is considered. So consumer surplus sees an added benefit of B plus C. It may appear that producers could also gain if area D is larger than area C, but that is not correct because this diagram does not take into account the effects on other time periods. Since producers would be overproducing, they would be giving up the scarcity rent that they could have gotten without price controls. So area B measures current profits only without considering scarcity rent. When the loss in scarcity rent is considered, producers unambiguously lose net benefits. So essentially, what this is trying to tell you is that although consumer surplus has increased by B plus C, this change from P star to PC, now producer surplus is D relative to before when it was C. Now, essentially, if D is larger than C, without scarcity rent and without considering dynamic decisions and intergenerational impacts, then yes, the producer would gain from this transition. But with scarcity rent, we talked about scarcity rent and how that is an unearned revenue to the business, right? So there is a value from holding that resource in the ground. And if you increase the quantity supplied, which is from Q star to QC, then you are depleting that value in the ground, which would be considered a positive to the business or the producer itself, right? So by limiting scarcity rent, you are actually hurting the producers while only helping the consumers. So when the marginal extraction cost ultimately reached the level of the price control, the amount supplied would drop to zero. Extracting more would make no sense to suppliers because their cost would exceed the controlled price. Since the demand would not be zero at that price, a shortage would develop. Price ceiling would restrict higher prices. So Congress may view scarcity rent as a possible source of revenue to transfer from producers to consumers in order to primarily please voters in their districts. As we have seen, however, scarcity rent is an opportunity cost that serves a distinct purpose, the protection of future consumers. And by ignoring that, even though the government is pleasing current consumers, it's actually hurting future generations. Okay? Over the long run, price controls end up harming consumers rather than helping them. Scarcity rent plays an important role in the allocation process, and attempts to eliminate it can create more problems than solutions. After long debating the price control issue, Congress passed the Natural Gas Policy Act on November 9, 1978. This act initiated the eventual phased decontrol of natural gas prices. By January 1993, no sources of natural gas were subject to price controls. And so Congress eventually realized this, and then they passed the Natural Gas Policy Act, and eventually the price controls were removed. So now moving on to the second core topic of Chapter 7, we're going to be talking about oil and the cartel problem. Since we have considered similar effects on natural gas, we note merely that historical price controls have been responsible for much mischief in the oil market as well. A second source of misallocation in the oil market, however, deserves further consideration. Most of the world's oil is produced by a cartel called the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, also referred to as OPEC. The members of this organization collude to exercise power over oil production and prices. When sellers have market power, they can restrict supply and thus force prices higher than otherwise. So this cartel controls the market and enforces monopoly profits rather than competitive equilibrium profits. So a monopolist can extract more scarcity rent from a depletable resource base than competitive suppliers simply by restricting supply. The monopolist transition results in a slower rate of production and higher prices. The monopolist transition to a substitute, therefore, occurs later than a competitive transition. It also reduces the net present value of society receives from these resources. So essentially, a monopoly will benefit the producers, but on a net benefit from a society's perspective, society actually loses net overall. And that's because, again, the transition to a renewable resource or a substitute resource will occur at a later time, and that slower rate of production limits the amount of value that is generated from this depletable resource. So essentially, the monopoly is trying to slow down that transition time in order for them to profit as much as they can. Okay? So there are 4 key factors that make oil cartelization possible. 1 is the price elasticity of demand for OPEC. 2 is the income elasticity of demand for oil. 3 is the supply responsiveness of the oil producers who are non-OPEC, so are not part of the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. And 4 is the compatibility of interest among the members of OPEC. And just a quick graph or a quick image over here of the members of OPEC. These are the big ones. As always, and probably you've heard in the news, Saudi Arabia, probably the big leader in OPEC. There are smaller contributors, so Ecuador, Nigeria, Venezuela. Venezuela has a lot of reserves, but, they don't really have a lot of say. So, there are a lot of issues with regards to OPEC, and so we'll talk about those. Actually, let me just get a drink of water first. Okay, so number 1. The elasticity of demand is an important ingredient because it determines how responsive demand is to price. When demand elasticities are between 0 and -1, so when the percentage quantity response is smaller than the percent price response, price increases lead to increased revenue. The price elasticity of demand for oil depends on the opportunities for conservation. The availability of substitutes is also important because it limits the degree to which prices can be raised by a producer cartel. So essentially, the first point is the price elasticity of oil demand. So are there a lot of substitutes for oil, or does the world really depend on oil for its energy needs? As of right now, as of 2017, this is a concern because it is very price inelastic. A lot of global markets or a lot of countries, they depend on oil. And so OPEC's control is increased due to that price inelasticity, because if they were to raise prices by just an incremental margin, they're actually increasing their profits. Okay. Now, the second point is the income elasticity of oil demand is important because it indicates how sensitive oil demand is to growth in the world economy. As income grows, oil demand should grow. This continual increase in demand fortifies the ability of OPEC to raise its prices. The income elasticity of demand is also important because it registers how sensitive demand is to the business cycle. The higher the income elasticity of demand, the more sensitive it is to periods of rapid economic growth or to recessions. Okay, so that's very important as well. Also, non-OPEC suppliers. This is a big issue nowadays. In 2016, with the fall of the oil price, the reason why the OPEC really lost control of the oil market in the recent years has been due to non-OPEC suppliers and their influence on the global supply market. So another key factor is the ability of producer nations to exercise power over a natural resource market in order to prevent new suppliers, not part of the cartel, from entering the market and undercutting the price. Currently, OPEC produces about 45% of the world's oil. Recognizing this impact, the cartel must take the non-members into account when setting prices. With a competitive fringe, which refers to the non-cartel members, it would set the initial price somewhat lower than the pure monopoly price and allow price to rise more rapidly. This strategy maximizes cartel profits by forcing the competitive fridge to produce more in the earlier periods in response to higher demand and eventually exhaust their resources. Once the competitive fridge has depleted its reserves, the cartel would raise the price, and thereafter prices would increase much more slowly as they would increase their control because non-competitive fridge suppliers would not have any more reserves. One fascinating implication is that the formation of the cartel raises the present value of competitive fridge profits by an even greater percentage than the present value of cartel profits. Those without the power gain more in percentage terms than those with the power in the earlier years. So, accounting for those non-OPEC suppliers, the OPEC does not want to actually increase the price to such a significant level because those non-OPEC suppliers will also benefit from that. So they actually try to control the price and lower it a little bit so that the non-OPEC suppliers reduce their reserves and really sell those off. And once they lose control of the market and OPEC really regains that ability to control the national resource, then they raise the price up. Okay, so in 1979, OPEC accounted for approximately 50% of world oil production, while in 1986, this has fallen to approximately 30%. Taking account of the fact that total world oil production was down during this period over 10% for all producers, the pressures on the cartel mounted and prices ultimately fell. The real cost of crude oil imports in the United States fell from $34.95 per barrel in 1981 to $11.41 a barrel in 1986. OPEC simply was not able to hold the line on prices because the necessary reductions in production were too large for the cartel members to sustain. Okay? And finally, probably the most important point and most relevant point as of today is the compatibility of member interests. As you can see, these are the reserves of each of the world's largest reserves based on countries. So Saudi Arabia, which is an OPEC member, has the largest reserves, and Canada's next, and they're not an OPEC. And then you have Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Venezuela, UAE, Russia, you have Libya, Nigeria, Kazakhstan, and the United States. The majority of these are OPEC members, except for Canada, the United States, Kazakhstan, and Russia. Right. So you have quite a few strong countries with a lot of reserves, but each of them have different interests. With only one seller, the objective of that seller can be pursued without worrying about alienating others who could undermine the profitability of the enterprise. In a cartel composed of many sellers, that freedom is no longer as wide-ranging. The incentives of each member and the incentives of the group as a whole may diverge. Cartel members have a strong incentive to cheat. A cheater, if undetected by other members, could surreptitiously lower its price and steal part of the market from the others. And so this is quite an important microeconomic concept that's talked about how in a market or an oligopoly, the incentive to cheat is very high because lowering the price, the gain versus the loss, consider an oligopoly with two producers, right? And they decide to collude. Now, the incentive to cheat is significant because if one of them decides to lower the price by a little bit, undercut the other guy, and really capture a lot of the market, he captures the full gain but only half the loss. And so there's that incentive there, and that's what it is with the compatibility of interests. The interests of the group need to be aligned, or there will be someone who's like, I'm going to benefit in the short term because I have less reserves than those in the longer term who benefit from holding those reserves in the ground. So formally, the price elasticity of demand facing an individual member is substantially higher than that for the group as a whole, because some of the increase in individual sales at a lower price represents sales reductions for other members. When producers face markets characterized by a high price elasticity, lower prices maximize profits. Thus, successful cartelization presupposes a means for detecting cheating and enforcing the collusive agreement. Okay. In addition to cheating, cartel stability is also threatened by the degree to which members fail to agree on pricing and output decisions. Since the 1974 rise of OPEC as a world power, Saudi Arabia has frequently exercised a large influence on the pricing decisions of OPEC. The demand for oil in the long run is more price elastic than in the short run. Countries with smaller reserves, such as Nigeria, know that in the long run their reserves will be gone, and therefore these countries are more concerned about the near future. Since alternative sources of supply are not much of a threat in the near term because of long development times, countries with small reserves want to extract as much rent as possible now. So that's where the conflict of interest exists. For the bigger members, those with much more reserves, they want to enjoy scarcity rent over the longer term, whereas for the smaller members who have smaller reserves, they They want to realize profit now because they understand that this is where they can take advantage of that, and they want to realize that marginal rent now. Okay. So talking about fossil fuels, there's also national security and climate considerations. All fossil fuels contain carbon. When these fuels are burned, unless the resulting carbon is captured, it is released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Climate considerations affect energy policy in two ways. One, the level of energy consumption matters, and two, the mix of energy sources matters, since some emit more carbon than others. Okay, and so these are the metric tons of carbon emitted by different fuel types. We have coal, natural gas, oil. As you can see, coal is the most polluting source of carbon, and that's why a lot of countries have already phased out coal. Right. So from an economic point of view, the problem with how the market makes energy choices is that in the absence of explicit regulation, emissions of carbon generally involve an externality to the energy user. Therefore, we would expect that market choices, which are based upon the relative private costs of using these fuels, would involve an inefficient basis towards fuels containing carbon, thereby jeopardizing the timing and smooth transition towards fuels that pose less of a climate change threat. So essentially, what this means, and what this slide is trying to get across when it comes to fossil fuels, is that a lot of countries are looking for the cheapest source, right, in order to maximize total economic surplus. It doesn't make sense to increase prices to an inefficient level if they can get the cheapest source. Unfortunately, the cheapest sources are also usually the most polluting sources, right? And so there's a conflict of interest there in which, do we care about those carbon emissions that are emitted, or do we care more about maximizing present value surplus, right? So, vulnerable strategic imports also have an added cost that is not reflected in the marketplace. National security is a classic public good. No individual importer correctly represents our collective national security interests in making a decision on how much to import. Hence, leaving the determination of the appropriate balance between imports and domestic production to the market generally results in an excessive dependence on imports due to both climate change and national security considerations. So, we talked about in the previous slide, this focuses more on climate considerations and how the cheaper energy sources are more polluting. On this slide, we're talking about national security. And usually you don't really account for national security. How do you quantify that? Well, when we talk about national security, we talk about the risk of, trade wars, or the risk of, relationships that break between countries, and therefore not being able to import goods from that country anymore, right? And if businesses depend on those imports, then that can hurt the country economically. Now, we can't quantify that, but if the market on its own would still go to the cheapest resource, which will probably be the one which is imported from a country who has a comparative advantage in producing that resource, right? So they'll probably go into the global market, that country, and decide, okay, which one is the cheapest supplier of that respective good, and I'm going to buy from them. And usually what happens, as the slide is communicating, is that not only will there be an excessive dependence on imports, but it will also increase the emissions due to, majority of them being cheaper than the much more safer and costlier sources, right? And so we can actually reflect this on the national security problem chart over here. So think of it this way. So domestic supply is reflected by two options. The first is SD1, which is a long-run domestic supply curve without considering the climate change damages. And then the second one is SD2, which is the domestic supply curve that includes per unit damages. So it includes that negative externality, right? So SD1 is, just regular supply curve without the negative externality of environmental impacts. And SD2 is inclusive of that environmental impact. Now, we don't include the national security premium on the domestic supply curves because we're talking about domestic supply. There's no national security in our domestic suppliers. National security comes from our importers, right? So when we look at imported foreign oil, which is reflected by these three supply curves over here. So we have P1W, which reflects the observed world price. So this is the world price, the lowest it can be. PW2, which includes a vulnerability premium in addition to the world price, and that accounts for that national security problem. And then PW3, which adds the vulnerability premium to the world price in addition with the climate change damage, right? So with these two supply curves over here are the domestic supply curves, and these three over here are the imported supply curves. Now, because we're importing these goods, there's no they're not increasing in nature, right? They're horizontal because when we're importing a good, the amount of consumption is not reflective It's not reflected if we increase or decrease. It's just the world price, and that's what we're being charged at that moment, right? So the vulnerability premium reflects the additional national security costs caused by importers. All three curves are drawn horizontally to the axis to reflect the assumption that any importing country's action on imports is unlikely to affect the world's price for oil, right? So we have the 2 domestic supply curves and the 3 imported supply curves. Now, this one is without environmental charges. This one is with environmental charges. This is the observed world price. PW2 is adding the vulnerability premium, and PW3 adds vulnerability premium plus environmental costs. In the absence of any correction for national security and climate change considerations, the market would demand D units. They'd go to the lowest price, which is on the observed world market, without considering the vulnerability premium, right? So I add D. Of this, A would be produced domestically. So if we look at the intersection point between the domestic demand and PW curve, that intersection point is the total sum of consumption. Now D is total consumption. Now the intersection point between PW and the domestic supply curve, the cheapest one, which is SD1, that's the amount that's produced domestically. So A is produced domestically out of D, right? And so the difference between D minus A is what's imported. When accounting for national security and climate considerations, then we add vulnerability premium to get PW2 and then climate considerations to get PW3. So the intersection point between PW3 and the demand curve is where we would consume that number of units. So you would consume C, right? And so moving across to the domestic supply curve that accounts for climate change, that intersection point indicates that B is produced domestically, and the difference between C minus B is imported. Okay, so that's important. So what happens when an embargo hits? Well, when an embargo hits, we can't really import anymore, right? So we're only producing domestically. When an embargo hits, we are therefore in the short term, the supply curve becomes perfectly inelastic, so it becomes vertical at A. So because we're so used to importing a PW1, the cheapest source, and producing only A domestically, then if embargo hits, it takes time for us to increase our ability to supply goods. So we are still supplying A. So when there is an embargo in the national security problem on this graph, the vertical line at A is the amount of supply regardless of the price. Okay, the price will rise to P star over here when there is the embargo to equate supply and demand. As the graph indicates, the loss in consumer surplus during an embargo can be very large. So it can be very large. Now, the importing country might become self-sufficient. Is it worth it in order to protect themselves against the embargo? Well, usually no. The vulnerability premium is lower than the cost of self-sufficiency for 3 reasons. The embargo isn't an embargo really going to happen? Well, they're not really certain events. Also, domestic steps can be taken to reduce the vulnerability of these imports, and also accelerating domestic production will incur a user cost by lowering the amount available for future generations. So making the decision to become self-sufficient will exhaust the domestic resources, which can hurt the country in the long term as well. Okay? For any remaining vulnerable imports, we can adopt certain contingency programs to reduce the damage an embargo would cause. The most obvious measure is to develop a domestic stockpile of oil to be used during an embargo. The United States has taken this route. The stockpile, called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, was originally designed to contain 1 billion barrels of oil. A 1 billion barrel of oil stockpile would replace 3 million barrels a day for slightly less than 1 year, or a large number of barrels per day for a shorter period of time. So responding to this question of whether we should become fully self-sufficient in order to protect ourselves against embargoes, one of the solutions is taking domestic steps to reduce the vulnerability premium by stockpiling some of the reserves, right? And so this gives us the ability to protect ourselves against a 1-year-long embargo. Okay? So there are other depletable resources. There's unconventional oil, there's coal, and there's nuclear energy. And so we're going to talk about these. So while the industrialized world currently depends on conventional sources of oil and gas for most of our energy, over the long run, in terms of both climate change and national security issues, the obvious solution involves the transition to domestic renewable sources of energy that do not emit greenhouse gases. What role does that leave for the other depletable resources, namely unconventional oil coal, and uranium. So the term unconventional oil and gas refers to sources that are typically more difficult and expensive to extract than conventional sources. One conventional source of both oil and gas is shale. The flow rate from shale is sufficiently low that oil or gas produced in commercial quantities requires that the rock be fractured in order to extract the gas. While gas has been produced for years from shales with natural fractures, the shale boom gas in recent years has been due to a process known as hydraulic fracking or fracking, right? Or hydraulic fracturing or fracking. That's usually the term that's being used. Okay, so essentially, when we're talking about unconventional oil and gas sources, think of the oil sands or think of shale gas. Now, shale gas, as identified in this graph over here, it's pockets of gas in the bedrock of different regions of these basins. And to extract that gas with fracking, what they do is they drill a horizontal well down here, and then they inject sand and water into the well, and then creating that pressure, creating these cracks in the basin, eventually allowing the oil to seep through into the pipe and then back up to the top. And so this has increased the efficiency of unconventional oil sources, but at the same time, it does raise some important questions about the environmental impact, right? Okay. So the main concern about these sources is also their environmental impact. It not only takes much more energy to extract these unconventional sources. In the case of the Canadian tar sands, large amounts of water are also necessary, either to separate bitumen from the sand and other solids, or to produce steam, depending on the oil recovery method. Okay. Now, what about coal? This is a picture of Beijing during one of its smog alerts, and this is a serious concern because in China and in Asia in general, to really meet that increased demand over the past few decades, there have been a lot of unconventional energy sources that needed to be used in order to really fuel the nation's economic engine. So coal's main drawback is its contribution to air pollution. High sulfur coal is potentially a large source of sulfur dioxide emissions, one of the chief culprits in the acid rain problem. It is also a major source of particular emissions in mercury, as well as carbon dioxide, one of the greenhouse gases. Coal is heavily used in electricity generation, and the rate of increase in coal use for this purpose is especially high in China. And the side effect of that is that the environmental damage is significant, and as you can see by this smog, it is incredibly threatening problem. And the government has taken already some steps to kind of mitigate this, but it is going to take decades to really recover from these decisions. Another potential transition fuel is uranium, and I'm actually a big fan of uranium. I feel it's a good investment option, and I've written a lot of research. So once again, check out my Seeking Alpha profile for that. So uranium is used in nuclear and electrical generation stations, but it has its own limitations, and the two key ones are its abundance and safety. With respect to abundance, technology plays an important role. Resource availability is a problem with uranium, as long as we depend on conventional reactors. With respect to safety, two sources of concern stand out. One is the nuclear accidents, and two is the storage of radioactive waste. Nuclear power has been beset by economic challenges. New nuclear plant construction became much more expensive, in part due to the increasing regulatory requirements designed to provide a safer system. And so the most recent nuclear disaster has been the 2011 crisis in Japan, the tsunami in Japan, which then flooded the reactor's coolers. And the reactor malfunctioned, and there were significant problems and leakages. And so that was a uranium crisis, and really shows the risks of employing uranium energy. At the same time, to really respond to that, the cost of producing and building new nuclear facilities has been significantly higher due to the increasing regulatory requirements, right? And so that's the discussion that we have here. So not all nations have made the same choice with respect to the nuclear option. Japan, along with France, for example, have used standardized plant design and regulatory stability to lower electricity generating costs for nuclear power to the point that they are lower than coal. With respect to waste, France chooses a closed fuel cycle at the very beginning of its nuclear program, involving reprocessing used fuel so as to recover uranium and plutonium for reuse and to reduce the volume of high-level waste for disposal. Recycling allows 30% more energy to be extracted from the original uranium and leads to a great reduction in the amount of waste for disposal. So can the market make the efficient allocation when considering the potential rewards and risks of, when considering uranium? If the utility accounted for the externalities that exist, then yes. So the curve MCA is the marginal cost of damage avoidance. The more precaution that is taken, the higher is the marginal cost. So on our x-axis, we have the quantity of precaution represented in units, and then here we have the price of precaution on the y-axis. So as the quantity of precaution increases, the price of precaution also increases. Now the MCD curve is the marginal cost of expected damage, and as we increase the quantity of precaution, the price of precaution declines because again the marginal cost of expected damage declines over time as we increase the damage avoidance efforts, right? So the efficient level of precaution is the one minimizing the sum of the cost of precaution and the expected cost of the unabated damage. And so that occurs at the intersection point between the two marginal cost curves, right? So at Q star. When the US allowed private industry to use atomic power, there were no price takers. Then in 1957, with the passage of the Price-Anderson Act, the government underwrote the liability. The act provided for a liability ceiling of $560 million, of which the government would bear $500 million. The industry would pick up the remaining $16 million. So let's go back here and let's take a look. Let's slow this down a little bit. So we have here the efficient level of precaution. So once again, the marginal cost, so MCA is the marginal cost of precaution, and MCD is the marginal cost of expected damage. Okay, so as the intersection point is at Q star. Now, in the United States, in the earlier years, in the 1950s, the cost of precaution was too high, and so no one wanted to really build a nuclear plant in the United States. So when Congress decided to pass an act to make it more favorable, what they did is they shifted the cost of expected damage inwards. They reduced the potential damage and potential legal liability of any nuclear disaster. And so that's what the Price-Anderson Act is. So the act provided a liability ceiling of $560 million. So, and with the government bearing $500 million, in any disaster, if the disaster caused, $560 million in damage, the company would only actually pay $60 million in damage. And so that lowers the marginal cost of expected damage and therefore reduces the quantity of precaution units. So as MCD shifts inward, the intersection point between MCA and MCD is at a lower level. And so the quantity of precaution is reduced, and therefore the cost of actually producing that plant is lower, and that's more favorable for the industry. So another alternative is, of course, electricity. Perhaps the most significant role for electricity is its ability to defer capacity expansion. Each new electrical generating plant tends to cost more than the last, and frequently the cost increase is substantial. When the new plant comes online, rate increases to finance the plant are necessary. By reducing demand for electricity, conservation delays the date when the new capacity is needed. Delays in the need to construct new plants translate into delays in rate increases as well. So governments are reacting to this situation in a number of ways. One is to promote investments in conservation rather than in new plants, when conservation is the cheaper alternative. Typical programs have established systems of rebates for residential customers to install conservation measures in their homes, provide free home weatherization to low-qualified, low-income homeowners. Okay, so essentially when we're talking about electricity, one of the big concerns with electricity is as demand for electricity increases over time, the cost of providing a new supply of electricity is significantly higher because the cost of that technology and the cost of making a new plant is significantly higher. So by delaying that, by conserving the amount of energy that you use and reducing the amount of demand, then the need to build a new plant is extended and it is delayed for 10 or 15 years. And so that cost is not realized today, but rather in the future. So that's really the discussion with electricity. Now, the total amount of electrical energy demanded in a given year is not the only concern. How that energy is demanded is spread out over the year is also a concern. The capacity of the system must be high enough to satisfy the demand even during the periods when the energy demand is highest, and those are called peak periods. During other periods, much of the capacity remains underutilized. Demand during the peak periods imposes two rather special costs on utilities. The peaking units fired up only during the peak periods have a higher marginal cost, and it is the growth in peak demand that triggers capacity expansion. So when we talk about the amount of energy demanded, really the concern is peak periods. So during the summer months, when everyone in the city is running their air conditioner, the demand for electricity is significantly higher. And the two problems and two takeaways from this slide are that, to really provide that additional energy in peak periods, the units, so the electricity providers in those peak seasons have higher marginal costs, and that needs to be reflected in the price. In addition, it's not actually the base load. It's not like the baseline energy consumption that requires the additional capacity expansion, but rather higher and higher peak periods. Because in peak periods, the problem is that, if people demand energy and there's no energy, then the system fails. So the energy providers must always anticipate that increase in peak periods, and that's why they respond by expanding capacity. Okay, utilities respond to this problem by adopting load management techniques to produce a more balanced use of this capacity over the year. One economic load management technique is called peak load pricing. Peak load pricing attempts to impose the full higher marginal cost of supplying peak power on those consuming peak power by charging higher prices during the peak period. Studies by economists indicate that even the rudimentary versions of peak load pricing work. The greatest shifts are typically registered by the largest residential customers and those with several electrical appliances. Now, electricity deregulation has also raised some environmental concerns. Since electricity costs typically do not include all the costs of environmental damage, the sources offering the lowest prices could well be highly polluting sources. And this is what we see a lot of the time. In this case, environmentally benign generation sources would not face a level playing field. Polluting sources would have an inefficient advantage because everyone would go to the polluting sources because they are much cheaper. One policy approach for dealing with these concerns involves renewable energy credits, so RECs. So renewable energy sources such as wind or solar are frequently characterized by relatively large capital costs, relatively low variable costs, and low pollution emissions. Okay? Renewable energy credits are designed to facilitate the transition to renewable power by overcoming these obstacles. A generator of electricity from a renewable resource can produce two saleable commodities. The first is the electricity itself, which can be sold to the grid, while the second is the renewable energy credit that turns the environmental attributes into a legally recognized form of property that can be sold separately. The demand for these credits comes from diverse sources. The most prominent are 1, the voluntary markets, and 2, the compliance markets, involving electricity generators that need to comply with new renewable energy standards. So, okay, key takeaway from this. Let me summarize this so that you understand it, because there's a lot of words, and this is what I hate post the midterm. There's a lot. The chapters are very just clunky and just full of different topics, and it becomes very boring. But essentially, when we talk about electricity, when we talk about peak load periods, right, we talk about how can we respond to that. Well, electricity providers have responded by charging peak load pricing. So they increase the price of electricity during peak periods, and so consumers respond by reducing the amount of electricity that they use. Now, from a supply side, the problem with that is that, when it is peak season and there is a lot of electricity demanded, usually they fire up the coal plants or natural gas plants, which are cheaper they're the cheaper solution but much more polluting. And so whenever you think of the efficient allocation, well, you go to the cheapest solution, right? You go to the cheapest provider. The problem is you need to internalize the externality of environmental impacts, right? The negative environmental impact of going to the coal provider. Right? And so what renewable energy credits does is it gives the renewable energy sources such as wind and solar farms these REC credits. And so they are able to sell those credits in order to really increase their revenues and then lower the marginal cost of their offerings in order to compete with coal and other more polluting sources. Okay, so another quite different approach to promoting the use of renewable resources in the generation of electric power is known as a feed-in tariff. Used in Germany, this approach focuses on establishing a stable price guarantee rather than a subsidy or a government mandate. The German feed-in tariff determines the prices received by anyone who installs qualified renewable capacity producing electricity for the government. In general, a fixed incentive payment per kilowatt hour is generated for that installation. The level of this payment is based upon the cost of supplying the power and is set at a sufficiently high level so as to ensure installers that they will receive a reasonable rate of return on their investment. So essentially, a feed-in tariff is is the ability for consumers to purchase these energy efficient appliances or energy efficient output meters, and then the government reimburses them and gives them actually money back for all the energy that they saved or they actually provided to the grid. Okay, so as the world grapples with creating the new energy portfolio for the future, energy efficiency policy is playing an increasingly prominent role. In recent years, the amount of both private and public money being dedicated to promoting energy efficiency has increased a great deal. The strong case for government intervention flows from the existence of externalities. Markets are not likely to internalize these external costs on their own. So the promotion of energy efficiency, the main driver of that has been the government itself, because in order to realize the externalities and the additional costs to the environment, the government needs to invest into that initially, and eventually the private industry followed. Okay, now ultimately, our energy needs will have to be fulfilled from renewable energy sources, either because of the depletable energy sources have been exhausted, or as in the more likely scenario, the environmental costs of using the depletable sources have become so high that renewable sources will be cheaper. Renewable energy comes in many different forms. It is unlikely that any one source will provide the long-run solution, in part because both the timing and form of energy matter. Okay, now here are some more energy efficient and environmentally attractive solutions. Of course, we have hydroelectric power, which is relatively simple to understand. Majority of people understand hydroelectric systems. You have a reservoir and then the dam, which holds back that water, and the dam lets a stream of water pass through it, and thus spinning a turbine and generating electricity, which is then sent to the electrical grid. We also have wind power, which is also relatively familiar. Many people are familiar with it. So you have the turbines, and as the wind blows the turbines, and the turbines turn the crankshaft, and it generates that electricity and therefore provides an energy for the electrical grid. We had photovoltaics, so solar panels, and so essentially photovoltaics involve the direct conversion of solar energy to electricity. Their attractiveness is especially high in regions that have not already established a traditional grid system of large generators and distribution lines. And so this is in developing markets. This is a huge positive for developing markets. There's also the potential for ocean tidal power. Now, this is not a real solution as of yet, but one energy source that relies on the natural cycles of the earth is tidal power. It capitalizes on the fact that coastal areas experience too high and too low tides in a period of time somewhat longer than 24 hours. The energy in that water, as it rushes in and out of an inlet or cove, is transformed into electricity by a conversion device, commonly a turbine. And there have been a lot of researchers who have attempted to develop this technology, but surprisingly enough, you'll see that this technology, they put this one turbine in, I believe in the Atlantic Ocean, and within 20 minutes, it got torn up. Like the tide was so powerful that the turbine overheated and it broke. And so it has a lot of potential in the future, but as of now, the technology is not realizable. We have also liquid biofuels, which are made from plant material and are currently receiving a lot of attention. And then we have geothermal energy. And geothermal energy is derived from the Earth's heat. When the temperature of a geothermal source is around 50 degrees Fahrenheit and higher, it can be used in combination with heat pumps to provide space heating in the winter and cooling in the summer. We have hydrogen. Hydrogen is a much more difficult thing to understand, and I'm actually going to skip it because it'll just confuse people, and the video is already so long. Oh my gosh. And then that's it. Okay, so that's pretty much it for chapter 7. I would say that the key takeaways is you really have to understand the oil cartel problem. You have to understand the price controls of in the natural gas industry. You have to understand the concerns of national security and carbon emissions, and also you have to understand unconventional oil sources and other renewable energy sources that might be considered, and also the nuclear power discussion. So those are some of the key topics that you should know for your class. As always, if you have any questions, please do comment below. I know these videos are quite lengthy, so hopefully you can kind of pause them midway, go get yourself a coffee, and then come back. But as always, good luck, guys, with your classes. Have a nice day, guys.